Thank you very much, Dar. Thank you for having me, and thank you for organising this wonderful lineup of speakers. And as you well know, these kind of gatherings and community events are more important than ever. So a big top doff of the hat to you and your team for making this happen. I am coming to you from Australia, from the lands of the Bundjalung Nation, the Arakwal people, which is in the area of Byron Bay on the east coast of Australia. And given that we are going to be talking about regeneration, regeneration really can only start from your place and understanding where you live. And I think many of us that want a better world and want to try and help this planet still remain disconnected to our own backyards. We can't identify the birds that wake us up each morning or the trees that we might pass every day. And I think it's really important that that's the first place to start. And so where I am, is traditionally one of the most diverse areas in the whole world. It was a park called the Big Scrub, and it was home to millions of different species of different animals and trees, so much so that the First Nations people here have 4 genders, not just male and female and neutral, but they have tree, they have arbor as a gender as well. So it was known for its abundance. And even today, we have beautiful coolamon trees. If you don't know what they are, have a look. They flower all over their trunks and branches. We have lemon aspen, finger limes, and a dazzling array of different frog species where I live. So for me, our area, regeneration, looks very different to probably where you are in the world. It's us replanting lots of these rainforest species and bringing back that abundance. That's what regeneration means for us, but it will mean something for everyone, no matter where their place is in the world. I think that's a really important way to frame this entire event and to understand what regeneration is. So as Dar alluded to, my journey in this space began about 7 years ago with the making of 2040. And my sort of trigger moment was on the tour for the Sugar film, actually. And I was reading a newspaper here and came across an article about another bleaching event on our Great Barrier Reef. And I probably read 2 or 3 sentences of that article and then turned the page and started reading a different article, and actually caught myself and thought, well, we've just had a daughter that's born. She was 6 months old. I care deeply about her future and this planet. And yet I couldn't read more than 2 or 3 sentences of that article. I felt hopeless, disengaged, overwhelmed, and quite useless in terms of what I can contribute to this huge barrier reef bleaching and climate. And I thought that was really interesting, and wanted to research more about the psychology of that. What was it that shut me down? And so I started doing a deeper dive on there, read some really interesting papers, came across a lady in America, an environmental psychologist named Dr. Renee Lertzman. Some of you might have heard of her. But she just had a beautiful conversation with her about how the brain works when we're only hearing the negative information, the bombardment of messaging we get in our media now about the crisis we face. Some of it very valid, but to only use that as a tool, it activates parts of our brain, the limbic system. And when that limbic system's activated, it shuts down the parts of our brains that want to problem solve and creatively think, the prefrontal cortex. So inadvertently, we are paralyzing millions and billions of people on the planet by trying to bang them over the head with, we've got to act now, it's urgent, it really matters. That's important. But if we're not showing them where the exits are, if we're only sounding that a fire alarm, but not showing people where the exits are, they will get stuck. And I would say that we have a majority of our population that some of them care about this, but still remain really disengaged or feel like they don't know how to act. So 2040 was really, I guess, an attempt to offer up an alternative in that space, not to shy away from the others, they're just as important, but to give people an alternative look at this, to think about this as an opportunity of what we could do on the other side of this crisis. What would it look like if we actually lowered our emissions in time and restored our landscapes and healed our communities, especially at a time where people are feeling so disillusioned about the current system, which we can get to. But I feel this is a very unique opportunity for us to present a better alternative and to get people excited about what that might look like and how it would improve their lives at an individual level, but also at a community level, their children's future, the foods they're eating, the air they're breathing, the water they're drinking, all these elements. We're just not selling that better future at the moment. So I guess that's a really important part of my role, I feel, is that the cultural influence. We know we've got to lower emissions. We know we have the technologies for that. We know we need to implement them quickly and bring the politics online. But that cultural piece, the storytelling piece that has traditionally shifted us as humans, we're a species that's evolved to tell stories, I feel has been severely underrepresented, because it's the culture that needs to change here for us to make meaningful difference and change. I guess the analogy that's kind of apt today is that if humanity is a forest and the people are the seeds, then the culture is the soil, and the health of that soil determines how the seeds will grow. And so that's where storytelling, moving away from this collective story that we are separate from nature, that we are inherently selfish and greedy. Yes, that's a trait we have, but we're also deeply cooperative, and we are nature. There is no disconnection. In fact, many tribes, the Achua on the border of Ecuador and Peru, don't have a word for nature because they don't think it exists. There's no separation between themselves and the living world. So that's the culture that's required, the shift, for us to enact meaningful change in this space. So before I introduce Paul, who I did meet along my journey and feel very grateful for that. It happened quite early. I was about a year into research for the film, and then was invited to the Telluride Festival in the US. And this man came on stage and started talking about this Project Drawdown that he'd just done. And I just couldn't believe how aligned it was, and all the work and the detail with which he and his team had done. And was lucky enough to have a conversation with him at that event, and then have developed a very special friendship since, and have been a big part of his new book, Regeneration, which we'll get to. But before I bring him in, I just want to very quickly, and I'll promise I'll only show one slide because we'll keep this very informal and invite you to have a conversation as well, so it's not just Paul and I speaking. But I really want to set up the context for regeneration and why it's so important. And it might be a new term for a lot of people. And I think it's particularly pertinent because we had some pretty big news this week, some not so great news about our need to regenerate. So if I just share my screen quickly here, I should be able to do it, hopefully. You should be able to see this slide here. So this is the Stockholm Resilience Centre. So this was set up in 2009 by a team of scientists. Some of you might have seen the film Breaking Boundaries, Johan Rockström's work, and also Professor Will Steffen, who's an Australian professor at ANU here. And they looked at the planetary boundaries, the ecological boundaries that we simply can't cross to live a sustainable and healthy life on this planet. And you'll see that green zone in the middle is the safe space for humanity. And they looked at these 9 different boundaries and to see whether we have crossed that threshold yet. And as you'll see, we've now crossed 5 of them. And the 5th one was actually crossed only a few days ago. Well, they released the data on it. It was crossed sometime before. But the obvious one there, I mean, some of this feels a bit scientific, but some of them, the climate change, we'll start there in the top left. You can see that's the obvious one. We're all very familiar with that one. We're at 1.1 degrees now over pre-industrial temps. And we're seeing the wildfires and the storms and the intensity of storms that we're seeing and flooding around the world. And that's just at 1.1 degrees. And to give some context there, if we were 1.1 degrees under pre-industrial temps, we'd be in an ice age. That's how delicate our system is and how fragile it is. So the fact that even if we met our Glasgow commitments, we'd still be around 2 or 2.1 degrees above pre-industrial temps. You can see that's not a world that any of us want our children to live in. It's crop failures, it's an impacted water cycle. The Amazon would likely flip and affect the water, especially in America, and the food bowl you have there in California. This could lead to refugees around the world, resource wars, authoritarian leadership, all the things we don't want if we don't address that quickly and in a meaningful way. The next one, the biosphere integrity, is actually around species lost, animals and plants and the extinction there. We now have 1 million animals that are facing extinction in the next 50 years. So that line has been crossed quite dramatically already. The land system change below that is, the obvious one is deforestation, clearing land for more development and growth, but it also includes things like mangroves, which we don't hear enough about. They can store up to 4 times more carbon than a tropical forest. And we've wiped out 50% of those mangroves since 1980. So that's the land system change. And then down the bottom, the biogeochemical flows, very scientific term, that actually means the phosphorus and nitrogen load. So the amount of chemicals we're using on our soils to grow our food. which is actually impacting our own health, as we know, but it's also destroying the life and the diversity in our soils. So that's one we've already dramatically crossed. And then the new announcement this week is the one at the very top, the novel entities. And what that means is I guess basically it's chemical pollution, in the sense of what have we introduced to the system in the form of synthetic chemicals. There are now 350,000 synthetic chemicals, and also plastics in our rivers and waterways. Plastic production, despite our best efforts of recycling and keep cups and all the things we have done well in the last 20 years, plastic production has gone up by 79% since the year 2000. So as you can see, there's a holistic approach is needed here. Sometimes we can get very focused on the carbon and the emissions, but you'll see there's a whole system that needs regeneration here. And that's what I wanted to set up here. The idea that to get to that sustainable space in the middle, we're going to require regenerative actions, regenerative processes. Sustainability is only achieved through regeneration, by bringing those breached boundaries back into that safe space. And that's really what I want to talk with Paul about today. His new book, Regeneration, which is out, I think Paul articulates the concept beautifully. It's the idea of putting life at the center of our decisions and actions. That's what regeneration is. At the moment, we have a deeply degenerative system. It's extractive and it's destroying the living world. But the good news is that if we start bringing some of these boundaries back, they are all so deeply interconnected that they can start healing other aspects. So if we start to deal with that land system change and bring that back into the safe space, planting more trees, healing our mangroves, we're also creating habitats for that biodiversity. So that line would start to come back in again, because we're allowing animals to live and not go extinct. At the same time, by planting trees and fixing mangroves, we'd also bring in climate change as well, because we're sequestering carbon. And the same goes for that by the chemical flows down the bottom, there's phosphorus and nitrogen, getting those chemicals out of our agriculture system, switching to more regenerative practices. We know we get healthier foods. We're pulling huge amounts of carbon into those soils, which impacts climate change. We're bringing biodiversity back. And of course, we're healing ourselves at a human level. So these are all the ecological boundaries. There's a whole other set for the social boundaries, which we won't get to now. But as many of us know, metabolic health, mental health, democracy, all these we've breached as well at a social level. So really, regeneration is our only option at this point. We are on a pathway to self-termination if we keep acting the way we are. We can get to that in our discussion, Paul and I, but that's why this concept of regeneration is just so critical in this moment. So I might introduce Paul at this point. I think I have to stop sharing my screen somehow, but I'm not sure how to do that. So Paul, are you there?
Oh yeah, I'm here.
Hi, Paul. So I think for most of you, you don't need an introduction to Paul. He's a bit of a legend in this space, and his recent book, Regeneration, is his 6th New York Times bestseller. So Paul, hello and welcome. And I guess I just wanted to start in the spirit of regeneration like I did. Do you want to just tell us a bit about where you are right now? What is your place and what is unique and beautiful about your place, and what would the steps of regeneration be or look like in your area?
Let's see. I like to go back a little bit because this thing is called the Drawdown Festival, and not the Drawdown preceded regeneration. It did in publication. Drawdown. The term is a scientific term that has been buried. Had been buried in 2001 after the third assessment of the IPCC came out. I was looking for solutions, just like I think everyone was, and I noticed then that there really was no place you could go, no website, no organization that gave you the list of all things that we could do. And the only thing there was something, the Carbon Mitigation Project at Princeton, but and they had the famous wedges and so forth, but 11 of the 15 wedges could only be accomplished by the vote of the boards of directors of very conservative corporations. And I thought that's not a good look or prospect for the future. And so, and that's when I went around asking people, NGOs and organizations, universities, institutions, can we, make a list and map, measure, and model, the most impactful solutions. And I also wanted to do is name the goal because then is now, in fact, and so forth. We don't really have our eyes on the prize. We don't name the goal. And for example, net zero is not a goal. That's a threshold for sure. Thresholds are very, very important, but it's not the goal. The goal is the regeneration of the world as we know it, and that you point to that in the Stockholm Institute boundary graphic that you showed, and so forth. And so the goal to me is reversing global warming, which is the cause of so many of those problems you pointed out, not all of them. And so I wanted to name the goal, and that was drawdown. And as I said, that's been in scientific parlance for 20 years prior to that, but just here and there and very obscurely. And so that's how drawdown emerged. And that's, of course, the Drawdown Festival. And that means, really that point in time when our greenhouse gases peak and go down on a year-to-year basis and so forth. And if we're not doing that, then it's Katie bar the door. It doesn't matter what else we do, because those warming impacts radically change, ocean currents and jet stream, which changes climate, changes weather, and weather it goes into crazy disruptive, cycles that we're not adjusted to as a civilization. And so, but all during that time when I was writing Drawdown, the text, we had 60 researchers all over the world doing the research, and we had 120 advisors advising us on what we were coming up with. I wanted to be a book from we talking to the bigger we. I think we should be talking, not, somebody who thinks they're right and knows something and tells people to listen up. I mean, I don't think that works anymore. And so I wanted to be collaborative. And but at that time, I knew that I wanted to do regeneration, because Drawdown is very much about what to do, but regeneration is very much how to get it done. And so even after Drawdown was published, and everywhere I went to speak, people would raise their hand and say, what should I do? What should I do? What should I do? These are people obviously wanted to do something, cared about it, but actually didn't know what to do, even having the book and so forth. And it was a fair question. And but more importantly, even if you said this is what you should do, which I would never do, tell anybody what they should do, but even if you did, it didn't tell them how to go about it, And there wasn't then, and really subsequently, there wasn't that kind of place you could go to for exactly how to restore degraded lands, which are 5 billion acres on the planet right now, from deforestation, industrial ag, overgrazing, fires, and things like that. And that's just one of 130 different solutions and challenges that offer us opportunities and possibilities. And you pointed it out, which is that we have dwelled on the probabilities of what's going to go wrong when and how it is going wrong now, and it's getting worse than we thought it was in before. And so, and we're drowning in this stuff, and we need to really and you did it well, by the way, your intro. It's like going, oh my God. But what we need to do is just acknowledge and praise the science. The science is extraordinary, and it comes at us, out of face if we're open to it. If we don't read it, it doesn't, but every day. And but we have to draw a line, just like we're drawing a line in our neurological sense, between the limbic system, the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex. We have to draw a line, and that line is between probability and possibility, and to recognize that problems are all solutions in disguise. That's what a problem is. It wouldn't be a problem if it didn't have a solution. I mean, you have to think about that. It's like, sounds a little glib. It's not glib at all. And so to look at the problem statement that you made, or the Stockholm Institute has made very well, and so many others, that are contained within those, where the boundaries have been exceeded, specific causes of those. But all of those problems have a solution and offer us a possibility of a very different world, which is quite interesting. I live on the unceded lands of the coast of Miwok. And they were, if I can be polite, Jesuited to death by Catholic missionaries. Mission San Rafael, the missions were set up. And, the missionaries came here with the doctrine of discovery from the papacy, in 1492, that in 86, which basically said that any land that was discovered by a country whose king was Catholic belonged to Christianity, and that whoever lived there basically was a subject, And if the indigenous people, the 500 cultures in North America and Turtle Island, and the 5,000 worldwide were just treated as subjects, we wouldn't quite be in such a bad place, but they weren't. They were treated as animals, as slaves. It was a Holocaust, it was genocide and so forth, and that happened to the coastal Miwok here. But we do have, as you do, much more so, I think, in Australia and so forth, lots of wisdom holders and knowledge, that have been passed through different tribes and cultures that are in California. And I think, like you there, I think we're beginning to realize that our indigenous cultures, I say our, but I mean our being the earth, not white men, a colonist, our indigenous cultures practiced for tens of thousands of years what I call observational science. And that science was the understanding of place. And you went right to it, because people ask me, what should I do? They still ask me that. What should I do? What's the most important thing to do? That was the most important thing to do. And the deceptive thing about Drawdown is that it's listed, in order of impact. And that sort of, I think that I would do it differently now in a way, because it's sort of had people say, I should do something in the top 10, the most important, most impactful. And that's not true at all. But I'll get back to that. The thing is that the most important thing you can do, if you ask me, and I've asked people back, say, you really want me to tell you what's the most important thing? And yeah. I said, find out where you live. Absolutely. Because until you understand, the speciation, the history, the cultural and biological, you can name the trees and name the birds, which ones are migratory, which ones aren't, the insects, the pollinators, which are wild bees, which are, the Italian honeybees. I mean, until you can make those distinctions in some way, you have no appreciation for where you live. And if you're living in a city, okay, that's, problematic. But Manhattan used to be called Mannahatta by the Native Americans who lived there. And it was an extraordinary place, an extraordinary island before the Dutch landed there. And so you can find out what was there as well, and what's missing, and what have we lost, what have we destroyed, what have we extirpated. And then again, it gives appreciation of what is possible. And to me, making that connection is really about falling in love, and outside, I mean, we probably shouldn't do this, I confess. I used to be on the National Audubon Society board, but we have 2 ravens that have adopted us, okay? and we are so in love with them, and they trust us totally, and we can get very close to them, and they make little noises. And if they found out, because peanuts used to drop from our nuthatch feeder for the birds, and so forth, and it's like, hey, can we have some of those? And so I put out peanuts and other things for them. And if we don't do that, we can hear them from our bedroom early in the morning, As a husband and wife, they're a pair, a raven's mate for life, But just that interaction, we have fox and bobcat and other things here too that come in. They even come inside the house, But unless you have that sensibility and so forth, regeneration may not mean as much as it could to you in terms of your emotion, in terms of your heart, because I really feel that, and as you spoke to very clearly, the climate communication, as well intended as it has been and is and remains so, is so basically, what's the word, inept is the nicest term I can use, This is Renee taught you, because basically we light up those parts of the brain to tell us to get the heck out of the way and forget about it and to shut it down. And by using those words of tackling and combating and fighting, and we're doing 2 things. One is we're othering. We say fighting climate change. What an interesting phrase, because we're othering it, first of all, as if it was an object instead of ubiquitous everywhere around us, as if the biosphere and the climate weren't the same thing. They are the same thing. One's gaseous, one's solid, just like our body. our air is gaseous and our body is solid, and so forth. So the earth is like, is the same, and it's one thing. We don't say, oh, we have a lung and then we have a body, or we have air and then we have a body. We don't make that distinction, but we do on climate. And that othering is the cause, that seeing, as you pointed out, nature is other, is something separate. That sense of separation is the sort of cultural disease that we're taught and imbued in and repeated over and over again in advertisements and everything we're taught to do in our, and so forth. And look where it's got us. It's got us with oceans acidifying, with a warming climate, with a tragic loss in biodiversity. And I could go on. But the point being is that when we say fight or combat or tackle, we make one other mistake, which is that we're talking about we're fighting change. I'm going, that's, good luck on that one. Because climate is supposed to change, for God's sakes, and if it didn't change, we wouldn't have, glaciers and rivers and fish and honeybees and hummingbirds and, all the extraordinary, beautiful, mystical, mysterious, complex living systems, that provide us with inspiration, food and life and companions and, inside, we wouldn't have it. So the climate is supposed to change. In fact, it can do nothing but that. And so we have, again, when we other it, we're sort of implying that somehow the climate is a mistake, or it's making a mistake, or we have to fix it. That's another term you hear from Bill Gates. We have to fix it, without ever telling us what it is, and so forth. And we have to understand that climate change is not the problem. What we do is the problem. That's the problem. And nature never makes a mistake. It can't, And so that's part of that healing, that separation, Damon, that you spoke to so clearly, and between us and the living world, as if they were distinct. Just because we're inside a room, inside a house, inside, or on Zoom, for God's sakes, it doesn't mean that we are not nature. And so regeneration is about putting life at the center of every act and decision, and then seeing the world that way. Because we live in a degenerative world. We live in a completely degenerative, extractive economic system, as you pointed out, and so forth. And the question is, do we want to keep going that way? And I don't think so, because you can see the end of that road. And that doesn't go very far. Last year was like, talk about a messaging from, the goddess of Earth, and saying, I really don't think you guys should go that way much further because of floods and drought and fires, and a famine and so forth. I'm not laughing at those things. I'm just saying I'm laughing at the idea that somehow we think those are just events, that happen someplace, and they're not. They're messages, to us. They're offerings from the earth to us, like, can you listen now? Do you get it now? And the good thing about last year, I think, is that for a lot of people, the global warming became experiential instead of conceptual. And that's a real breakthrough.
Yeah, I love what you were saying there. And I think this idea too, which I'd love to touch on before we get to some of the really exciting solutions, especially the nature, the ecological solutions, and the capability of these natural systems and what they could do for our emissions. I think what you were just touching on there, and you've mentioned this before, that while we talk about renewable energy all the time, we talk about carbon sucking machines and batteries and EVs, that the most important technology we have in this moment is our hearts and minds and our imaginations. And it makes me think, when you were talking before about this scholar and theologian, Michael Dowd, who spent years looking at Indigenous cultures and what were the traits of the ones that got through sustainably. And all of them had very future thinking ideals within their tribes, but also developed that sense of sacred, that they taught that to the children, that the animals and the plants were like relatives, and they would get their children to speak to the trees and speak. And I think that is arguably one of the most important things we can all do in this moment for our teachers, for our parents, to make sure that we're imbuing this next generation with that value and meaning for the living world. Otherwise, this system and the inertia of this system can suck them away, pull them in very quickly, and suddenly they do form that curtain between the living world and their screens and their devices. So I would argue that everything we talk about today is going to be important, but that is one of the fundamental things we should be doing for our children, is to bring back that meaning and connection. So Paul, I just want to quickly, before we go into those, I just wanted to hear your own, I guess I'm interested, and you've been in this space for a long time, but there's a debate going on at the moment around facing the reality of what we're dealing with in this moment and the benefits that can come from that, of actually letting yourself feel the damage that has been done. We are nature, so it should hurt when we see continual deforestation or this amount of plastic and chemical in the world. And if we do let ourselves feel that, and I certainly went through that to a degree, it does free up the space to move forward and take action and focus on those solutions. And I wonder if you had an experience of that, or how you deal with that now, given that you've been watching this for a considerable amount of time and seeing the increased damage. How do you balance the emotion of that and deal with that peril versus possibility duality that you must have on a daily basis?
Yeah, the grief, the sadness, the despair, I feel them. And I think we're supposed to feel them. Something, and eco-anxiety, Clover Hogan talks a lot about that, and so does Renee Lerchman, whom you mentioned. And somehow there's things about what you do about your anxiety. I look at it a little bit different, which is the anxiety, which is stress. It's very stressful to be anxious. Stress is a human emotion that is there for a reason. Mm-hmm. It's not there just by happenstance, it's there to tell you to do something. Mm-hmm. And the only way I know how to process, and I think you're the same, is that I probably deliberately, of course, and because I write, but process more troubling and difficult information on a daily basis than almost 99.99% of people, because that's my job. Self-appointed, nobody asked me to do it. But if I don't know what's going on in the world, how can I speak to it? And on all levels. And I joke, I say, I only do that in the morning. If I did it at night, I wouldn't sleep. It takes a whole day to process it. But I think that and this is, you touched on a really important point. I want to ask the same question back to you, Damon, but because I've been so impressed by what you've done in Australia, and just the talk about action. You do so much, and you have a new 17-minute film coming out, Regeneration Australia, I forget which is, excuse me, but if I messed the title, but it's got both words in it. And that's coming out, and it was just delayed because of COVID, the new lockdown, and so forth. They'll come out in a few months or less. But the thing is, you have just, you have consistently just gone to the next thing, and acted, maybe very much like, the Drawdown Festival, act, do. That's what Drawdown Festival is. It's a do day, a do weekend. And but I feel like what it oftentimes is missing is this understanding that doing changes us, as opposed to we feel bad, we should do something, which that comes out of, I was brought up Catholic, but I might as well, I was taught guilt from an early age often, and that almost can't mistake or escape the guilt, that when you do something because it's so screwed up and bad and troubling, and that, then you feel relief. Don't feel relief. It's not about relief. It's really about changing yourself. And what we know, and I say we know, I did know, I learned it from Andrew Huberman at Stanford, a neuroscientist and so forth. And what we know is that beliefs do not change our actions. Even if we act, they don't change our actions much. They just don't. Actions change our beliefs, how we see the world. And they change the beliefs of people around us. And it's hard to imagine that, given the scope and the breadth and the depth of global warming and the impetus and the inertia and the momentum of it, when you're thinking yourself as an individual, which is actually kind of a delusion anyway, you're not really, but that's what we wake up with every morning and think we are, but when you think of yourself as that way, you got to do something. It feels so meaningless, so small, so minuscule, when compared to the problem at hand, the task at hand, and so forth. And it's not. It is not. because you do change people around you. Look at Dar, look at the whole group who created Drawdown Weekend Festival. Like that, were they just one person? No. That's my point. We're part of networks, we're part of groups, and that's what you've done so amazingly in Australia. And I would love to ask you what you do, how you process. You have two daughters now, and they're young and they're gorgeous and they're beautiful and they're cute as buttons. And one of them is in 2040 and the new one isn't in a movie yet. But how do you process as a father, who, not only looking to the end of your life, what you can do in life, but you're looking further than that, to their life, and I would love to know more.
Well, there's a beautiful term called the Stockdale paradox. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but he was an admiral in the Vietnam War, and he was a prisoner of war for 7 years, and was one of the very few to make it through, and talked about what got him through such trying circumstances. And he talked about that the people around him, the soldiers around him that were negative about the situation, obviously they perished quite quickly. But even those that were positive about the situation, they would often think, well, I'm going to get released at Christmas, and then Christmas would come and go, and they would very quickly deflate and perish. But he talked about it was the ones that really honestly faced the circumstances and didn't try and shy away, let themselves feel the horror of where they were, but developed this sort of unwavering, muscular, radical hope within that they would get through. And I feel like I relate to that sometimes. I don't shy away from feeling the sadness of what's happening, especially in my country, the fires, the Great Barrier Reef, the 3 billion animals we lost during those fires. I let myself feel that and cry accordingly, or whatever that took. But then I make myself, like you, I'm sure, I think not many people spend much time looking deeply at the solutions or focusing on what people are doing around the world, and the extraordinary suite of tools that are being developed as we speak right now that aren't getting any air on the mainstream channels, aren't being talked about anywhere near enough on our social media networks. It's what Rebecca Solnit talks about, the hope in the shadows, that away from the hope in the dark, away from that spotlight on the main stage, if you look in the wings of that stage, wow, like you can't help but feel inspired. And I spend, and you do too, a lot of time in that world. And I see what farmers are doing in regenerative practices. We have 40,000 farmers in Australia now. 10,000 of them are now doing regenerative or biological farming. It's a quarter of our farmers. I see what's happening with community energy projects, participatory democracy and governance, the incredible minds that are now working on what a new system might look like on the other side of this. What are the incentives? What is a market look like in a different world? Like, all those discussions are going on right now. We don't hear about them, but I can't help but feel some glimmer that we've got a shot of pulling off what would be the most remarkable transition ever as our species. And think about those historians that might look back 300 years from now and think, well, amidst all the nihilism and the doom and gloom and the surrender and the chaos, there were people out there that were the regenerative designers, and they were thinking about what a better world looks like, and they were planting those seeds to build that future thriving civilization. And once you start connecting with those people, as this event is doing, your spirits lift. You feel like your life has meaning. You're not getting stuck in the paralysis of that overwhelm and despair. You feel like you're part of something special. And no matter where this ends up, what a beautiful way to live your life regardless, that you're trying to contribute to a better future for your children and their children and all living things in this beautiful system. So, I still have my moments, and especially with our daughters, but I want to teach them resilience and how to grow food. We've planted nearly thousands of food forests in the place we're staying at the moment. And, my daughter's knowledge of food is better than mine, and the tree species and her communication with the animals there. That's, I think, the best I can do in this moment, to teach them those things and to prepare them for whatever might come. But to know that deep connection that they're developing, I want more children to get. I want more people to understand that. And I think people are ready. You'd be the same. I feel like all of us are feeling a dis-ease with this system. We all intuitively know these are not radical conversations anymore. They might have been even 3 years ago, but I'm sure you're finding, speaking to certain CEOs of very big organizations, they're having these conversations. They've all got kids, and some of them don't know how to unravel from the system and the complexity that we've developed, but they're all thinking about it. and working out what they want to do next. And that groundswell of pressure that's coming from the kids and the next generation that's demanding change from those organizations as well, that's only going to intensify.
Yeah.
So they are having those changes. So I do genuinely still think that we've got a shot of doing something remarkable in the next few decades. And I'm not willing to give that up yet. I know others have, and I've read their books and I've talked to them and I've heard them, but I'm not ready to go there yet.
I'm not either, because, you know, I mean, I have less time to stay on Earth than you do. I'm older, so I'm leaving sooner. But it doesn't matter when you're going to leave, how long you might be able to stay here. The question is, who do you want to be and what do you want to do while you're here? And given what we know, do you want to write nihilistic books and tweets about, we're screwed, it's all screwed up, and, and give up, game over, all that sort of stuff. I mean, it was actually people saying game over when Bill McKibben wrote that piece in 2013 on global warming's terrifying new math, that actually created Drawdown. And Drawdown now is in 18 languages and is taught all over the world, and and so forth. And it was really people coming to me from that article saying it's game over, and I'm going, really? I mean, sometimes game over is really surrender, it's giving up. Good, give up, because that's an opening. I feel like when people ask me that question, will we make it? Is there enough time? And all that sort of stuff, which is of course an unanswerable, unknowable question. I tell people, if I answer that question, it's a Wizard of Oz question, run, like, I don't know. I'm just like you, but I do think this, and I say it, which is, and sometimes NGOs come to me too, we've been working so hard for X number of years on X, and we've grown, we're bigger, but the grossness and inertia, the momentum of the problem, seems like we're not, adequate, we're not doing enough, and so forth. I said, this is my belief. This is a belief, okay, is that the climate movement, in the broadest, most amorphous sense of the word movement, not like any movement we've ever seen in our life or heard or described, so forth, will become the biggest movement on Earth, without question. And the reason for that is weather. It's not because some charismatic leader is going to show a woman or man and lead the way and so forth. They're here. There's thousands of them everywhere, who are doing it right now. It's because of weather. And what we are doing, and I say we, meaning not you and I, or including you and I, but sort of everybody who's listening tonight, and so many others around the world, is we're rehearsing the future. Mm-hmm. And so when you're rehearsing, if everybody, you're an actor, I did theater growing up through high school, University of California, so when you're rehearsing, there's nobody in the audience, first of all, or if somebody's there, it's, the production manager or actually the director making notes on it, but you're playing to an empty hall, and then comes dress rehearsals, you're still playing to an empty hall, so forth. Then all of a sudden, you're on stage and the audience is there. And the point being is that, it can feel that way, cavernous, empty, like, I'm part of the 2%. 98% of people on Earth are not doing anything right now. They may be sympathetic, but empathetic. They may understand the mechanism, but they're not doing anything. And so it would be logical for you to say, oh God, I'm working, doing this, all my mates are, gathering together, we have great time and doing it. But, look at over there, they're on cruise ships and they're flying around going, whatever. And it'll change. And it won't be changing because we're, basically mau-mauing. It's going to change because of weather. And just like it happened last year, it's going to happen this year. And so to understand that, because when you're in a hole, when you're in deep trouble, when you're like, oh my God, hit the wall in your life, who do you turn to? Mm-hmm. You turn to people who understand, who've gone before you, either experientially or in the case of understanding or knowledge or respect or practice or, whatever it is, depending. You don't turn to somebody who doesn't care and doesn't know. And so we are building up a cultural biological, social, uh, uh, celebratory, regenerative narrative and experience and knowledge and understanding.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's who people are going to turn to when they want to eat, when they want comfort, when they want warmth, when they want understanding, when they want to join something that makes sense.
Yeah, and you see the signs everywhere of that movement growing and getting larger and more accepted. And as you said, I mean, we saw it in Australia after the fires, the amount of interest and sudden action and movement from all sectors in this space, and that they're going to keep happening, those shocks, as we know.
Yeah.
And I think it's important too, you touched on history there, that we live such a linear existence now that we think that that's how history and time works. But all these great changes through history have never occurred in a linear fashion. There's been a build-up of momentum, and suddenly the dam wall breaks. And I think of people like Emmeline Pankhurst and the suffragettes, and could only get 3,000 women to march, and then you had the president even saying of the US in 1906 that no sensible woman wants to vote. And then 8 years later or 10 years later, bang, the floodgates open and things change.
Right.
Same with the abolitionists. If you told them 50 years before the slavery ended, they would have been laughed at, that no economy can survive without slaves, or if we give up slaves, we'll lose our economic advantage. Exactly what they're saying about fossil fuels now. And suddenly we have these tipping points. And it's the same with these disruptions of the printing press, or even the motor vehicle comes in. It creates such enormous change very quickly that we forget that that's possible again. It might happen next year. It might happen in 5 years or 10 years. But that's a great motivation to keep going as well and build up this community, keep growing these networks, because when the moment does come, people will need tools and they'll need the know-how, and they want to know how to do a veggie garden or heal the soil or implement a community battery. So the work that everyone is doing that's on this call is those wisdom keepers and those guiders that can help and usher people through in that moment. And some people might panic and they might feel stressed, but if enough people understand what needs to be done and can handle it calmly in a balanced way and make it feel kind and comfortable and exciting, then I think we're all doing a great service. And as you said, Paul, that might happen not even in my lifetime. It might happen beyond my children's, but that's why this work is so important to do now, irrespective of that.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of acceptance right now in that we're in an exponential age of change. The change is exponential. But when they talk about it, they focus on crypto, AI, and robotics. It's like, fair enough. But actually, the exponential change is going to be people trying to figure out where they live and how to live. And in a way that makes sense, because the way we live right now doesn't make sense at all, and it just defies any basic common sense of relationship, in terms of water, air, creatures, soil, health. All the things that we want to check off, that we need to be healthy human beings are being just shattered and fractured and destroyed and polluted. And so, people are going to wake up. They are going to wake up, and a lot of people are going to, put their head in the sand and, try to protect themselves. And, but most people can't afford to do that, and what they can afford to do is start to connect. And really, all this is about making connection, taking action. And the connection you make is to another person. It can be to something you love to do. Damon, I just wrote a thing. I should send it to you, actually. Just so everybody else, we really are mates in this sense. We matter. We talk and meet and conspire. And our websites, the new one is coming up, is so beautiful. I saw little bits of it so far, but I haven't seen it all. But we're trying to do work bilaterally. So when you go into one, you can go to the other, fluidly, as if you're a fish in the water, as opposed to a siloed URLs. And because we really want to make regeneration and regenerators all a collaborative, expansive thing where there isn't a top or a hierarchical structure or arbiter of it. And that's what we work on. So we talk about it. But I was writing about insects, and it's so interesting because, there's this whole thing about the insect apocalypse, and I'm smiling, but I'm not smiling about that. But it's so interesting about it was a beautiful thing, was that it was discovered by amateurs. in Germany, in the Krefeld Society. They've been around from 1905, and these are people who just love insects, and they could be accountants or bookkeepers, or they could be teachers, or they could be, truck drivers, whatever. They had a thing about insects, and they would capture them and put them in where they captured it, what it was, identify it, and put it in, shelves, and put formaldehyde, put a pin through it, all that sort of stuff, since 1905. I mean, this is, and then, but about 30 years ago, they started to drive down these highways in Germany with these big sort of nets or tubes, really, that where they could capture insects, opened up, and they would go drive down, and then they would drive so many miles the same day in the same month, month after month after month, for years, 30 years. It's so dramatic. I'm sorry. It's like, oh my God. And measure the biomass, right? In these shoots, and then, and the day and this and how much biomass, is in it, because, and then they sort of did the math, and they discovered that in over a 3-decade period up until 2016, 40 to 80% there've been a 40 to 80% drop in the insect population. And then a scientist found that and was shocked, and they looked at their data and said, oh my God, this is impeccable data, and then published it, and that became the insect apocalypse. That story, that's how it was named. And then people, amateurs from all over the world, said, yeah, here too, here too, here too. The point of this story is that, yes, in Nexus, in our website, we talk about all the amazing things that people can do and are doing all over the world, to support insect populations. There's 1.4 billion insects for every human being on Earth. We really, we rest on their existence. But the what was so beautiful about that story to me was it was about amateurs. And the amateurs had discovered things that shocked the scientists. Usually it's the other way around, and amateurs means the one who loves. That's what amateur is. And I, 4 tortured years of Latin, amator, that's where it came from, which is lover. And I think we have to celebrate the fact that we're all amateurs at planet saving. But an amateur means the way to resolve or to work with where we are and to regenerate life on Earth and all this living on Earth is to fall in love, which I went back to, is to be an amateur, and be proud of being an amateur, not like, I don't know enough. You know a lot, because if you care, that's who you are.
Reminds me of the video that we recently made about regeneration, and featured beautiful Jeff Bridges in there, and that was his definition of regeneration. Regeneration to me is love, is just loving this planet and everything that lives on it. And if we can put that at the heart, then we will transform this system. Mate, I just quickly, I want to take some questions in a second, but I just want to get on to some of the elements that were really exciting in your book, I think, because I think the idea of you really phrase quite articulately what needs to happen, especially in terms of the climate crisis, that those 3 things of lowering our emissions as fast as possible. And we kind of know that narrative. We know it's, getting onto renewables and batteries and EVs as fast as possible, and other things that are emerging in hydrogen and other spaces. We know we have to protect that carbon that's already in the system, our forests and mangroves there, because if we keep cutting those down, we'll release more carbon into the atmosphere. But this idea of the solutions that can draw down carbon once we regenerate them, I'd love you to talk about some of those in the book. The idea of the azolla ferns, or what the seagrass is, that oldest living organism in the world, and how much carbon that's taken down, or even the kelp, for all these things that people might not be familiar with, that are such beautiful, enriching solutions that also create habitats for all that biodiversity. Can you just talk about through some of your favorites there, or some of the surprises that you discovered in researching the book?
Well, actually, they relate directly to protect as well. And and the reason they do is that there is, so far as we know, we think there's more, but 3,300 gigatons, billion tons of C, not CO2, C in our terrestrial systems. And that includes our forests and our grasslands and our coastal wetlands and the seagrass marshes and the mangroves. And that's 4 times as much C is in the atmosphere. Okay, So we can look at that two ways. One is if we lose, that is, and we are losing these systems, let's be honest, degrading them, and the Amazon converting the forest into, grazing land. If we lose just 9% of that, and over time, we will increase the ppm of greenhouse gases by 100 ppm in the atmosphere. It's not just coming from our cars and trucks and, coal-fired electrical generating plants. It's kind of, okay, flip it. So if we actually increase the amount of carbon in these terrestrial systems, I'm putting the oceans aside right now, not the coastal part of the oceans, but the deep ocean, the seaweed, macroalgae, and so forth, putting that aside, if we increase it by 9%, we will have the same amount of greenhouse gas levels as we had in 1800. And we know how to do that. And we know how to do it with regenerative ag for sure. And that includes a broad variety of intercropping, agroforestry, silvopasture, obviously farming directly in terms of, grains and cereals and so forth. And we know so much about regenerative. I think some people sometimes classify regenerative farming as, organic or sustainable, or, going back to things we used to know. I would say, yeah, the things that worked in the past, definitely, from indigenous people, from Asia and so forth, are incorporated and integrated into regenerative farming. But there is a whole bunch of farmers, some of the most brilliant, and I'm not trying to make you feel good, are in Australia, because they work in a more harsh, arid, dry, sere environment. And so the challenges are greater. So that's where you have the breakthroughs. But it's an emerging technology in regenerative farming, which is just brilliant when you drill down and talk to these men and women and what they're doing, what they've discovered. Sometimes the couples like the Haggertys out in Western Australia and so forth, and they've made so many breakthroughs, in how to restore the land, which is just brilliant. I mean, even the Green Wall in Africa, which is going up, was discovered by actually an Aussie, how to do that, because he realized that the trees that have been cut down could regenerate instead of being destroyed, and regenerating trees that have been cut down so to become part of the Great Green Wall. And so we have now people and experts and groups and clubs, and so forth, working with seagrass meadows, which seagrass, the plant in seagrass meadows can be the biggest organism on Earth. We used to think it was a fungi. I think it was aspen groves and a fungi. Now it's seagrass, but the amazing organism they are under the water, and again, like mangroves, the amount of carbon they sequester is astonishing. And we plow them up, our boats go over them, we tear them up, we dredge them out and so forth. It's like, no, don't do that, And so we're starting to do the opposite with that. And we're starting to recognize, again, what you mentioned, mangroves, which are just, and again, it's that thing is like, everything is connected, which is kind of a cliche, but darn if it isn't. And so when you replant the mangroves, you're creating one of the most complex, exciting ecosystems in the world, where you could spend 10 lifetimes trying to figure out who's there and what it's doing and how it interrelates. And so in even the soil too, in terms of the microbiome of the soil, we have no idea what's going on down there. And all we know is that there is just astonishing number of different bacteria, protozoa, obviously there's worms, there's bacteria, and it's like a whole colony and they're eating each other. And as they eat more and more, the carbon chains get longer and longer and longer and turn dark and black, and it produces glomalin, which makes the soil friable, and more water penetrates, and there's more water, then the plants stay more resilient to drought or too much water if there's too much rain, which feeds pollinators, and the pollinators are there. If we didn't have pollinators, insects, we wouldn't have fish, and certain, freshwater fish, and it just goes on and on and on, when you start to pull the string on that sort of flower bag of the earth, and it just never ends, never ends. And you start to see how the smallest thing can be the largest thing. And so we can. I mean, the idea of 30, again, 3,300 billion tons, that's a lot. Can we increase the amount of carbon in 30 years by 1/3% a year? That's what we're talking about here. Yeah. Now, we haven't done one thing about reducing, fossil fuel energy in that calculation. Just that alone will take us to 280 ppm by 2050. So it's just, again, I think regeneration, and I'll stop here, is a lens, it's a framing, it's a way of seeing the world that perhaps you hadn't seen it before and understood it. And it's a way of seeing the world that can bring so much meaning to oneself, to one's family, to one's community, to whatever it is. But also it produces work that is dignified, that has purpose, that has meaning, to people all over the world, and this is the work that needs to be done now and so forth, not catching COVID on, cruise ships, ruining Venice. And so there's better jobs out there, and it's regeneration is where to go. And I think we will.
Beautiful summary, mate. And I think especially at a time where we're talking about these giant carbon sucking machines on the edge of our cities, which again is that reductionist mechanistic mindset. When you do actually explore what nature is capable of, something that she's been working on for billions of years, she's been pulling carbon out of the atmosphere like a professional. And you hear those stories about that, the seagrass in the Mediterranean, this one particular patch that's been growing for 200,000 years and has sequestered 36 feet of topsoil it sits on. That's how potent you can sequester carbon. Or the Azola events, that I think was it 50 million years ago. It's a huge bloom in the Arctic, and it took the emissions from 3 times what they are today to back to the levels we have now. This one blooming of a tiny little fern. So if we can harness that power again with all these benefits that Paul talked about, to filtrating water and bringing, rich omega-3s back to our livestock by feeding these ferns, cleaning up rivers. There's so many cascading benefits from doing these things and working with nature that, as you said before, why fight it? Why other nature when it's actually our greatest ally in this moment? That we need to work with it to get through this moment. So thank you, Paul, for your beautiful eloquence and all the work you've done for so long, and you've been an inspiration to me. And I really want to invite anyone now to join the conversation, ask a question, make a statement, whatever you want. We're all in this together. Love to hear your views or thoughts or any exciting regenerative project you know about or solution. Just pop your question in the chat or in the Q&A here. I think there's a couple here already. So one of the questions here is, how do you think we can more effectively use social media to create connections and invite people to join the climate movement? That's a very good question. I mean, Paul, I'm thinking straight away of what our friends Harry and Alana are doing with the climate action system. If that can work, very briefly, what they're trying to do is create not a social media network, but a social action network that allows people to get into circles, meet with other people right around the world to share knowledge and information about regenerative actions that they're implementing. And you get sent alerts when there's a group of people that might need some advice or help. So we actually reconfigure the networks we have right now, which are largely, as we know, geared to tribal in-group dynamics and descend into sort of arguments and tribalism, that people are working already on new networks that bring us together, that promote consilience and action moving forward. So I think we have to almost acknowledge that the social media we have right now is not serving us in the best possible way. That said, we all have an obligation to choose carefully what we do put out there. Are you sharing stories that perpetuate us as being selfish, fighting each other separate from nature, or can you offer up more regenerative stories and posts to contribute to that collective hive mind, if you will? Paul, do you want to jump in there with anything?
No, I think that's good. I mean, social media is basically a black hole. I mean, it's just absorbing. I mean, that thing about if something's free, you're the product, and that's you're the product of social media. You're being sold, and it's an instrument of consumption, of materialism, and that's why Facebook is so rich, and that's why Google's so rich, and so forth, because they've learned everything about us, and now they're selling it to marketers who then are trying to sell us and entice us to buy. So it's very difficult to use social media in a way that, to me, that's conscious. Doesn't mean the messages can't be conscious, but you're participating in something that's wholly extractive. And what we need to do is share and learn from each other, not So I have very mixed feelings about it. We use it, you use it. I'm sure everybody is using it, but it's probably enough said. I think what I would say about it, I think everybody knows. There was one question about philanthropy, which from Sheila Pfeiffer, or Pfeiffer, it looks like Pfeiffer, excuse me, Sheila. I just look at it and so forth. I would say that there's a piece by Ellen Dorsey who's saying basically to her
Sorry, Paul, what was the question? Can you just repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry, the question is, could you say something about philanthropy and the relationship to regeneration? I'm sorry. And there's something I want to say is what Ellen said in the book. She is the Wallace Global Fund, and is that it's time for philanthropies to pay down, which is they're paying 4 or 5% a year, or here, I don't know what they do in Europe and other places, but they're supposed to pay down a certain amount, and then they invest, and they even make more than that in many cases for the last decade. So they're growing, they're growing big piles of money. And those big piles of money are usually in holdings that are marginally questionable, if not totally questionable, or maybe they're not at all, but it's hard to hold $1 billion, 10 billion, 5 billion also, and be in just, green small biz. You can't do it. And, but what Lorene Powell, who is Steve Jobs' widow, has started a new foundation. I think it has nearly 4 billion in it, and it is designed to pay down in 15 years. Boom. No, it's gone. And I think that philanthropy should start acting like there actually is a planetary emergency, instead of keeping its endowment intact and growing it during this time. How are you growing it, to what end, and this time? So I think that's the thing about philanthropy, which is to actually roll up your sleeves and get in there and figure out what to do. If that means you're not here in 20 years, but the planet is, then you've succeeded. Yeah.
In that similar vein, Paul, I love in your book the idea of not carbon offsets, but actually making people have carbon onsets, so that you're not just offsetting the damage you've done, but you're also doubling down and giving back what you've been using. Have you had much of a response to that, or had any discussion? Know of anyone that's doing that?
Yeah, I do. And the point being is that there's a quote there that says, offsetting a loss is not a gain. Yeah. And it says anonymous. Actually, it's me, but I said, well, I'm just gonna put anonymous. Because I mean, the offsets is crazy. Not to offset itself isn't crazy, but the idea that somehow you can say, oh, I offset my emission, right back where you started. It's a gerbil wheel. It doesn't do a thing. And so unless what I do right now is, I fly, I very little right now, not just because of COVID, I don't want to go, but it's 10x. I do 10x the carbon emissions. And I do the 10x for getting to and from the airport too, and so forth. So, and the problem with that is that the carbon is so cheap right now, it's ridiculous, and that's because only 5% of the offsets actually sequester carbon. The others are, additionality or protection, which is good, but it's being sold for $3, in the United States. In Europe, it's $90 a ton. Get real. And we are still, I don't know what we're thinking here, but anyway. But yeah, I mean, the thing is that we have a legacy. Each of us does, each company does, each, entity has a legacy of emissions and so forth. So if we're not drawing down in our carbon when we do offsets by doing onsets, then again, we're not looking at the problem in a really, holistic way, and we are not participating in a way that actually makes a difference.
Can you, that's happening in Australia too, just by the way, the idea of the carbon credits, again, is so reductionist. We've got groups of people out here that are literally just doing torching places and destroying all the biodiversity and life in a region, but they're still eligible for that credit because they've got rid of some grasslands. It's such a reductionist perspective of dealing with the problem. So there is work to do there. A question here, it's come up a couple of times. It's a very practical one. Not sure you're going to know the answer, but maybe in the research, in terms of the mangrove forests, which are such beautiful carbon sinks, how long would it take to actually regenerate a mangrove forest?
I don't know. Yeah. Because I don't know where you draw the line. Yeah. I mean, where do you draw the line saying, okay, it's regenerated, you know, I mean, it never stops. So that's really important to know, that just like the seagrass, you know, 36 feet of carbon underneath it, it never stops. Mm-hmm. And so mangroves don't stop either. They don't reach a plateau, you know, or climax stage, and then it's like, you know, zero in, zero out. And so they're you know, and I don't think anybody has measured it, you know, year to year from a restoration process all the way to, you know, semi-mature, you know, that'd be interesting data to know. But we do know that, as you said, you know, 4x, you know, anything up in an Amazon forest or tropical forest at a mangrove. And so the possibilities there. And the thing is, we don't really know the limits yet in terms of carbon. I mean, in terms of our soils and other things, we really don't know. Everything's so degraded, so dehydrated, so messed up, really, you know, that there's a farm, a Katz's farm in I think Ohio, there are Katz, I think, you know, and I mean, he is now at 9% carbon, you know, in his soil, and they measured the woodlands that, you know, around him, you know, which are wild and, you know, and never farmed and never been cut or so forth. And they're only 6%. So he went right on by, you know, a natural system. And so that's the exciting thing about, you know, what you're talking about, you know, in terms of sequestration and restoration, you know, restoring a degraded land and so forth. We don't know the limits.
We don't. And there's some extraordinary results coming out of a lot of Australian farms here. In many ways, we have some very pioneering farmers down here, as you alluded to, and just some of the results they're getting. And it's not just that soil carbon, but just all the ripple effects of how the sponginess of that soil and how its ability to hold the water and then seep down into the aquifers and go back into the rivers, or even the idea of the water cycle, which I guess, you know, isn't talked about often enough anyway, that once you are covering that soil or planting more vegetation, that can create these microclimates again, and you start kicking off these little miniature systems. And I think you've got a beautiful story in there in the book about that Kenyan tea farmer who was wondering why it kept hailing in his particular region all the time. And he decided to do a little measurement and check the microbes in the rain, and found they were the same microbes coming off the tea leaves. So he was creating his own weather system just by the vegetation he created there. That's what's at our disposal. That's the power that we have here if we harness it properly. It's magical, and it has all these beautiful elements to it. So yeah, I love that story in there, and a lot of our farmers here are starting to find that. And as you said, some of them have been quite surprised with how much carbon their soils are actually able to hold.
Right. Yeah. And the beautiful story about that is it applies everywhere. It does, you know, which is when we change what's on the ground and what happens on the ground, it changes rainfall patterns, the hydrological cycle, you know. And we used to think it was just the long cycle, which is from the ocean, you know, and it came inland and dropped its rain or snow or whatever, and then, you know, disappeared. And we know so much more about short rain cycles now, which is they arise on the land and they drop on the land. And that's, of course, one of the tragedies of clear cutting the Amazon, which is it's just an enormous generator of rain clouds and moisture for other areas, not just the Amazon itself.
Mm. There's a question here that relates to where the festival's being held. Actually, it's about Long Island. Can you share, Paul, an opinion on biochar and how potentially we on Long Island could carbonise our organics to achieve the magnitudes of sequestration? Many here are discussing the idea, and we'd appreciate your inspiration.
Yeah, I mean, when you have green waste, so-called green waste, there's no such thing as green waste in my opinion, but anyway, that's what municipalities call it. And if you can create biochar from it, you've done two things. One is you've captured the carbon, of course, and if it goes into soil, though, you've done another thing. You haven't just buried it in the soil and, removed it from, basically emitting into the atmosphere. You've actually created, a domicile. You've created this amazing, amazing habitat for bacteria, a microbiome. So you've enabled the microbiome in a way that I don't think there's any other way to do it except feed it, with obviously the sugars, from the roots, the carbohydrates, but biochar has, it was practiced, because we think about the Amazon, that's where we discovered it, but actually it turns out it's been practiced by indigenous people all over the world. West Africa absolutely use biochar. This was just common sense for people who had no, it's empirical science, except they had observational science, which is, hey, this is working better. And so they did it, and they never stopped. And so taking our green waste, that which is taken away by municipalities and so forth, sometimes composted, sometimes not, sometimes buried, sometimes, whatever. The best thing that could happen to it, besides compost, is actually biochar. I think a little bit of both, or not a lot of both is what we want to do. We want to get the compost back on our farmland, especially on the peri-urban boundaries, where small farmers are trying to basically establish themselves into farmers markets, into local restaurants, producing local food. I mean, any way we can provide them with a rich, humic acid in the form of compost and nutrients, is really, again, circularity, completing, a cycle of life, that feeds us, feeds them, feeds the microbiome, feeds the pollinators, feeds, human health. So green waste is, there got to be a better term than waste, is green goddess. I don't know, whatever. That's the salad dressing, but we need a better name than green waste.
Look, a couple of times the questions come up around, which we haven't really touched on tonight, but this idea of restraint, of localism, of the system as it is right now. And I think it's a really important probably discussion for us to have. It's probably a whole other hour and a half, but we won't go there just now. But this idea of I guess, the flawed architecture of our current system that isn't incentivizing these regenerative practices that we're talking about. It really is incentivizing the opposite. And how we deal with that, because we know everything's out of balance. We've got a system that is rewarding largely sociopathic behavior. It is incentivizing more production of manufacturing wants, of the things we don't need. And they are the things driving all these planetary boundaries, including climate change. So that is a bigger, deeper question. I know you touch on it in the book. You talk about the role of industries, this idea of a political industry, of a poverty industry. You've talked about philanthropy. But I think it does come to the crux, doesn't it, of everything we've talked about right now. If we don't shift what we're incentivizing in our system and what we're rewarding, a lot of these things are going to be very, very hard to pull off.
Yeah, I mean, the question came from Paul Gartside, and it's a very, very, very good point. Why in Drawdown Regeneration we don't talk about, reduced consumption. We do obliquely, but not like behavior. It seems to me, and I'm not copying out here, Paul, other Paul, that it's like, duh, it's obvious, I mean, if this is having a big impact, you do less of it, has less impact instead of, but there is this idea, and there's no question about it, that somehow if we swap out all the, the fiber in our clothing and where we get our food, and we have an EV, and we put heat pumps in our houses, and we do all good things to do, but it's a conversation really pretty much from the privileged talking to the privileged. In other words, can we just keep things the way they are, and our consumption patterns, and cycle, and what we buy, and all that sort of stuff, and Amazon's going to have EVs, and they're going to recycle the cardboard. It's like this so-called consumptive wet dream, I call it. Like we can do just as much as we do now, but only differently, and so forth. And of course, that's just not true. And but I think the reason I left that out is because it's, to me, it's tacit. It seems obvious, but perhaps not obvious to people. But I think behavior is something where, we do discuss behavior, because any technique is about changing behavior. Going to a plant-based diet is behavior, but it has specificity. Reducing consumption is just like a line, and that's it. Next, that's just stop already, And so the reason they're not in there as well is that you can't model them in a way that others. And the problem when you model solutions, and I'm criticizing ourselves now, not the question, is that you silo them. In other words, you have to make a boundary and then measure within the boundaries. But the boundaries are artificial. And whereas reduced consumption it encompasses everything. In other words, it has no boundary. That's the point. It affects every single system, every single aspect, every single solution that we're talking about is aided or harmed by the reduction or the increment or the maintenance of current consumption patterns. It's a great question.
I think too, the depth of that, what's behind this consumption, there's a host of reasons, but I think one of them is this idea of unmet needs in people, that they're not actually craving the thing, they're craving the feeling that thing gives them. And so how can we steer people away from needing the thing to actually finding the other deeper meaning in their life to fulfill that? And that's what we're talking about, which I think Regeneration offers as a movement, is it is about connecting with others. It is about prioritizing life. And I'm sure you've felt it, but I feel it too. That's what keeps me going, is the people I've met in the last 6 years, or what I've been privy to, is absolutely joyous. And my wife criticizes the state of my clothes because I don't buy anything anymore. But there is something in that if we can actually shift that sense of meaning, which people have put into consumption, and it's now failing them so badly, that there's this beautiful opportunity waiting there to be a part of regenerating the planet. Like, there could be nothing more meaningful than that. What a way to live your life. So how do we bring people across there, or get them to understand that? Is part of the work, I guess. But I think there's more and more people starting to realize that when you are helping others and you're connecting with others and you're helping the planet, you yourself get a reward that you didn't know was possible until you've experienced it yourself.
Yeah, I mean, the reward of consumption is so shallow, and everyone knows it, which is why they increase their consumption. And the reward of doing work together with friends and community, and making a difference in people's lives, and the lives of things you don't even know necessarily, is stays with you forever. I mean, and so again, I think that the gracelessness with which we live and consume and buy and so forth. We all feel it, I mean, or if we don't feel it because we're not doing it, we see it, we see the effect and impact it's having. And it really goes down to, and I think it's sort of understand a mechanism, which is an odd mechanism because it's never existed before on Earth like it is right now, which is really the work of Thomas Piketty, the French economist who wrote the book Capital. And what he pointed out was about, almost 200 years ago, capital, money, he's talking about money, not natural capital, social capital, intellectual, he's talking about money capital, okay? He said, but happening, we created mechanisms where capital just wants to increase itself. And prior to then, capital was created by increased productivity, and we figured out how to do things better, faster. But once it passed a certain threshold, capital is just growing all by itself, and it has its own. There is $600 trillion of notes and debt and pieces of paper in the world right now. Okay, it's like, what? And I mean, the GDP is only between 80 and 90 trillion, so it's like almost 7 to 8 times greater than, what happens every year in terms of transactions, which most of which are questionable, by the way, but put that aside, there's $600 trillion of paper that people own. That's owned by somebody. It's not just paper up there in heaven or in hell. And who owns it? Do they feel rich? Probably. A lot of them. Do they act on it? Yes. What do they do? they buy things, they go buy stuff in our cities and makes rent unaffordable for people who just have normal lives and jobs, I mean, it's just, and we are in a kind of tumultuous, asymptotic growth of capital right now. There's so much money in the world floating around, and the damage it's doing. And Paul Pullman, who was the CEO of Unilever, and I remember being with him at Marlborough House with heads of the Commonwealth nations and so forth. And he said something, because a lot of the nations are talking about, we need more, we need more, we need more. Botswana, and Pacific Island nations and so forth. India certainly. And he said, the problem with the world right now is there's too much money, which sounds so odd to people, like, well, I don't have enough, but it's true. And that's distorting everything in such bizarre ways right now. And so, yeah.
Yeah, that would be another one on the social boundaries that we've breached. That
Yeah.
wealth inequality is such a big destabilizer of any democracy. We can't keep doing what we're doing there. It's insane.
Yeah.
Mate, I'm very aware of time. It's come up a couple of times, and I know you've been asked this question a gazillion times, but I think it's a nice way to end. Just in terms of the advice of the simplicity of what people can do. I think I know what your answer is going to be, and I'll share mine as well. But, when you do get stopped or people write to you and say, oh, this is all great, it all feels existential, what can I do? What's the simple step that I can personally do? What's your go-to answer?
It's always the same, really. It depends on the person, how I say it, but it's the same in the sense of, you want to find something that, as I say, lights you up. That's it, And so I have no idea what that is for you. And anything else would be presumptuous on my part, The book Drawdown and certainly 2040 and Regeneration and what we're doing is certainly, points to all the things that can be done. I mean, the opening of regeneration.org says, the most complete listing and network of climate solutions and how to get them done. Okay. So you got your shopping list. Okay. I think the thing which you want to do, and I wrote this thing about insects that I described, because really it's not about the insect apocalypse. It is in the sense of, hey, let's do something, but it's really, maybe you do connect in. Maybe, as I talk about, dragonflies with, their wings like bejeweled like, ball gowns and, living for 1 month, out of their 2 to 5 year life, and the rest of the time is underwater like nymphs. And, they're just so spectacular and beautiful and magical. But you have to find what it is, that absolutely lights you up. I mean, Stefano Boeri, who creates, the vertical Bosco Verticali, the vertical forest in Milano, now in China and so forth. And his work is being copied all over the world, like forests that go up. There's some in Melbourne and so forth. I mean, that's what what lights him up is to make a city in the forest, not put some trees in the city. Okay. And he's serious about it. And that is existing cities, by the way, not new cities, that are created from scratch. And he does such a beautiful job. He's such a beautiful man, and he does beautiful designs, and he's working on, I won't go into all the details. What I'm just saying is that lights him up. That's what he does, and he lights other people up because he's so passionate about it and so excited and so competent and knows so much and so forth. So everyone you want to find what is it that you do. I just, the two brothers, in Ireland, have, the Happy Pair, which is a business, these two twin brothers who set up this shop. It was just a vegetable shop, and they're semi-pro athletes, and they could have been a lot of things. And they both became vegetarian, vegan, at the same time, independently, separated from, one was in BC, and one was in South Africa, and they both decided they want to become vegan. And they teach it, they have classes, they have product, and so but they started with nothing. Why? Because they got so excited about it. To this day, I don't know how many years later, they're so excited. You want to say, calm down, calm down, calm down. That's what you should do. Find out what that is, and because that's that's, that's the thing about falling in love, I mean, maybe that's considered too romantic, the term love, but I mean it in the broadest sense of the word, fall in love. Yeah.
And I think that when you do find that thing, you're more inclined to talk about it and be passionate about it, and people can feel it in you and they feel inspired and they want to learn more. And I think because we're all living in a degenerative and extractive society, that even a simple thing can actually be really powerful. Even coming to an event like this, having a conversation about this with a friend, it's the opposite of extractive and regenerative. That's actually a regenerative practice, and we need everyone to be doing that. And because we are such social animals, and study after study shows that if there's a fire and someone grabs a bucket and puts out the fire, another human will run and help them. Or if you put solar panels on your roof, the chances of your neighbors putting solar panels go up exponentially, because we're constantly sending cues and signals to each other. So sometimes we can feel like we have to do these big things and set up this big organization and do it, but we don't. If we can just simply ask the waiter, hey, where does the meat come from? Is it regeneratively? I mean, that does something to that waiter and starts a new train of thought. So I think it's important to understand that, to not create an anxiety by thinking you have to do something huge. It's just where you're at right now. If you can find that thing, as Paul said, that you're passionate about.
Let me tell you a story. I know it's running out of time, but you just prompted me, because I was at University of California, Irvine, and then speaking to trustees the next day, we're talking about a panel for professors and trustees, and somebody asked about deforestation. It was the last question. And I wasn't chosen to talk about. Two other professors were, and I listened, about deforestation. It was like very technical. And I raised my hand to the moderator. I said, can I say something? And I said, sure, what do you want to say? I said, you feed 35,000 people a day. Okay. Your meat is supplied by JBS, the biggest meat company in the world. And the reason I know that is because they own 40 meat companies here in the United States. Okay. And they are pivotally involved in deforestation of the Amazon. This is about procurement. And the chancellor was there. And it sort of blew him away that the university had procurement as a method to change behavior or what you buy, and to communicate and so forth. He then took that to the Board of Regents, to the chairperson, a relatively young woman, and this is the biggest university system in the world, University of California. It's 250,000 students matriculate every year. And she got so excited about it, so forth. But that's just a stray comment for me. I mean, it was like, you should, look who you're buying from, and so forth. So this is what everybody has, that capacity. Everybody has that capability, just to be aware, awake, and alert, and share,
That's a beautiful note to end on, Paul. Thank you for this beautiful conversation, and for particularly your last couple of books and the impact and the conversations they have sparked, and the films that they've prompted. Thank you to Dar and all her team for organising this wonderful event. We need more of these, more regularly, coming together and discussing. And to end, it's my great privilege now to, we talk about the potency of storytelling and the role of art and how we change culture. Well, this fella is head of the queue in terms of what he's doing. He's recently been named one of the UN's 17 youth global leaders, and he's using his skill, which is music, to spread a beautiful message of hope and change. He powers all his concerts with renewable energy. He's the first in the world to do that. And we're very lucky to hear from him right now. Paul and I might tap along or click or turn off our screens. We're not sure how we'll go here, but I'd love to introduce you to AY, who's going to lead us out with his beautiful song about regeneration. Over to you, AY.
Yo, dude, I've been reading this book called The Regeneration, and it's by this dude named Paul Hawken, and it's all about regeneration's recreating all that was lost, and how humans and nature, we have to come together, right, to power, change and make this happen. And so I made a song. I think it could be the anthem. Let me show you, man. I'll show you the song really quick on here real fast.
What's that?
Oh, yo, this is the battery to it, bro. I actually power, this is solar, and I store energy in batteries, and that's why it's called the battery tour. And I use it to power all my concerts. And I also made the whole album, all this music I'm making, off of renewable energy off of this thing. So here, let me show you, dude. I'll just like walk you through the record, because like you got to really feel the lyrics and stuff. And it's all about changing the world, right? And if anyone's listening, they just, just the vibe, you know what I'm saying? You feel me, bro? You know?
Oh, sister, mister, look who's made our minds up.
We can't make our minds up, we gotta come together.
Now I can't find the reasons not to give
All
up.
the change makers, we can't give up, you know?
Teachers, leaders, dreamers, let's go. They always take the right away. Leave the bell and make you bed. We can change the world. Is that a lie they told us? We can change the world. We'll shine a light back on us. We can change the world. So we got to come together now. Got to come together now.
Got to come together. See, I don't like it any more than you do.
But everyone's ignorant,
But in your
sometimes, right?
ignorance, that bliss is
We
for.
can't avoid these issues, we gotta come together.
So it's about time be humble and realize that we are one and the same, unique and one of a kind. 'Cause brighter days come ahead when we join together. Put your best foot forward, go and make an effort. This is AY, I spoke to Akon. Marvin gave me in the grapevine. Let's have a great time. Let's change the world, influence great minds. I'm trying to paint my version
I'm
of
just trying to
Picasso.
change the
This
world
is
and bring it
colossal.
together, you know?
So
They always take the right away. Leave the bell and make you bed. We can change the world. Is that a lie they told us? We can change the world. We'll shine a light back on us. We can change the world.
Yo, yeah, I know. I mean, I think it can be like an anthem for something, right? Like, I'm telling you, everybody's an outlet. If we can all just take a step toward regeneration, we can make it happen. Yeah, that's it, man.